We're going to hear a wonderful presentation. We're switching gears to hear from the organizational lead from Local Futures, Anja Lynbaeck. Local Futures, for those of you who have read the book Ancient Futures by Helena Norberg Hodge, I highly recommend it. It was part of my formative transformation to understand the kinds of economies we could build outside of the notion of Western progress that's been dominating through militarism and colonization. So much of the effects of what that militarization and colonization has created, you see showing up in the lives of Abena and Santa, this kind of machine-like approach to things that really need to be humane and human-centered. And there are communities around the world who have not been buying into that particular notion of progress. And Local Futures has done an incredible job holding up, for me personally, but for so many people who've been imbued with the philosophy and understanding that we can organize our economies differently and we can center them around humane values. And so I'm going to introduce Anja before she presents to you all. She is the Associate Director of the international non-governmental organization, Local Futures. She is the coordinator of the International Economics of Happiness Conference and World Localization Day. She has worked for 3 decades to further local food systems and place-based economic models in service to people and planet. She divides her time between a village in Mexico and an island in the Danish archipelago. And she has a background in rural resource management and agroforestry. And she's a passionate food grower. And I know today she would probably be happy to be in the soil, but she's joining us kindly and sharing her time. Thank you, Anja, for being with us.
Thank you, Rebecca. It's a real pleasure. And I only caught the tail end of the other talks. But I assume they are being recorded, so I'll be looking forward to seeing the whole thing afterwards that I missed. It's a bit dark here, but it's evening at my end. I'm tuning in from Denmark at this point in time. I'd like to, Rebecca, I'd like to screen share because I'll be showing a PowerPoint presentation while I speak. Is that okay? Can you,
you can go ahead and
enable me?
Yep, you're good to screen share. You should be able to screen share now.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Sorry, just a moment.
No problem. That's okay. We're standing by.
Right. I think I'm good to go now.
Yep.
Can you see?
Yep. Looks great.
Good. Well, so I'm going to speak to you about global to local, about a need to shift from a global economy to local economies towards place-based and human scale economies. So I'll be speaking about more than just beyond the textile and the specific content of Fibershed, because this has to do with everything within the economy. So it's very difficult to separate one thing from the other. But, so pretty much, I think this is what summarizes our economy today. One of exploitation, both of humans and of nature, and one of depletion. And most of us realize there's something terribly wrong with our economy and are questioning the current model. At Local Futures that I work for, we've spent a lot of time, actually decades, trying to raise awareness about some of the underlying root causes of the multiple crises that we are facing today, both human and social crises, as well as the ecological economic crisis. And what we are seeing, we were collaborating with a lot of organizations and people across the world, is that the global growth economy is what's driving the multiple crises. You may have been speaking about this before, I'm sure, but basically an economy that's based on continuous growth, defined by GDP, cannot but become destructive. It's centered around what has become basically a casino economy run by algorithms, where that is not tied to any real wealth. 90%, 97% of all money is made out of thin air. It's debt-based, so it only comes into existence when someone makes a loan, be that a corporation, an individual, or a nation state. And what we have today is like a kind of de facto global governance by banks and big corporations that are squeezing our nation states and influencing our governments across the board to create laws and regulations that favor further globalization and transnational corporations at the expense of people and communities and the planet. We are the ones basically that are getting squeezed. And kind of a pattern of the policies that shape the economy we see today and our societies is that we are over-regulating and taxing the small and the local, while we've been deregulating and subsidizing the big and the global, which has meant that we got a very false picture of what is efficient and what is working. It's a very false economy. And one of the key things that have created this deregulation of the corporate world are the free trade treaties that we are seeing all over the world, and that have become more and more far-reaching over the decades. They're basically treaties that are negotiated behind closed doors, not involving civic society. It's undemocratic. They favor large corporations at the expense of people and planet. They increase the gap between the rich and the poor, and also enable corporations to sue governments if and when they want to protect the environment and people. So we're seeing that increasingly. There's called investor-state dispute settlements, and this takes place also behind closed doors and in a sort of unofficial courts, kangaroo courts. Let me see, I'm not having trouble here. So this so-called free trade, which is driving what we call a race to the bottom for the people and planet, because it enables corporations to move around at will and compete on the lower salaries. We just heard that this, getting people to work more, few environmental regulations, job security, which basically means that you end up competing on the lowest common denominator. In order to have growth, this is how corporations can increase their profit, by paying people less, by not looking after the environment, and of course by increasing sales. I just wanted to give one example of free trade. As Rebecca also mentioned, I live in Mexico most of the time, And in Mexico, when we had the North American Free Trade Agreement, there was had a massive impact on agriculture and food production. Because the tariffs were removed, subsidized food from the US came in at a much lower price and outcompeted local farmers. That meant a 15% increase in imported food from the US. Basically, over the years, an estimated 7 million farmers have lost their livelihoods as a consequence because they couldn't compete with the subsidized food from the US. 15 million people migrated to cities and about 2 million migrated abroad, and Walmart spread across the country. In the US, something similar happened, not with the food production, but in the textile industry. So between 1990 and 2011, in the US, you lost about 750,000 jobs in the textile industries. And today, as far as I understand it, 98% of the clothes that is worn in the US is imported. And the average distance from a producer to the consumer is 13,000 miles. Now, this is by no means unique, but it shows how the free trade don't actually benefit nation states, certainly doesn't benefit people, it benefits corporations. We've had a similar thing in Denmark long before that, when we became part of the EU, which with itself is a kind of free trade bloc. That's how it started out. And in Scandinavia, before, we used to grow hemp, for example, for for clothing. Sorry, and with the EU, it became too difficult to compete with cheaper labor. So manufacturing, everything in the Scandinavia closed down, our own textile production, and that was moved first to France and Belgium, later to Romania, and today most of the clothing that we get from Bangladesh and China. So basically, we've seen that process of where the distance between producers and consumer have become bigger and bigger and more centralized. So basically deconstructing local and regional textile systems. And it's not only the free trade treaties, of course, but the subsidies, kind of corporate welfare packages that have characterized the last 20, 30 years. We have been hearing a lot about fossil fuel subsidies in this COP26, but we haven't heard about it before. For decades, we have been subsidizing fossil fuels, making products with fossil fuels a lot cheaper than, for example, by using human labor. So the IMF in 2015 calculated that we were giving $5.3 trillion in subsidies that included like tax exemptions and so forth, and 500 billion in direct subsidies. Equally, we have been subsidizing, using taxpayers' money all over the world, the global transport infrastructure, which is part of the problem. It makes products coming from far away cheaper than products coming produced locally. And also the subsidies, for example, to industrial agriculture, where we hand out about $1 million per minute to industrial agriculture across the world, compared to only 1% that is given to regenerative farming, has also been fueling, for example, the industrial textile industry and artificially cheap clothing, like the polyester clothes. So, and it's been driving what we call insane trade, where we have redundant trade, where we often import and export the same products. This is very well known in food. I'm sure the same thing is true of in the textile industries, although I don't have any data to show. But this global trade, the free trade treaties, the subsidies have increased global trade that has increased global emissions. As you can see here, we have a parallel increase in global emissions. And it's not something we've been talking a lot about. And this has led to a process of depletion and pollution that we are now also familiar with. And it's also led to an economy of equality where, you know, increasingly we see fewer and fewer people having the same wealth as half of the global population. We call it the economy of the 1%. And I used to talk about this some few years ago, and the number was 85 people, the richest people had the same wealth as 50% of the population globally. Then it went down to 62 to 26 to 8. I don't know what it is today, maybe it's 4, but you get the trend. And at the same time as we've had this economy of inequality, we've also had this explosion of consumption. And of course, clothing, as you well know, is one of the best examples of this, but by no means the only example. And it is the growth economy, the need to increase profits more and more, like a cancer, that is driving this consumption explosion. That we call it the consumer culture, but I think that's too nice a word. So it's quite clear that we now consume more than ever, and it keeps increasing. Here we have some of the highest consumer per capita, US, UK, and Germany, and others like Denmark is not far behind. And I'm sure you've been talking about fast fashion, and you do that all the time. That goes hand in hand with the planned obsolescence, as I was also hearing, I think it was Santa was talking about earlier, about how the clothing doesn't last. It's not made to last, like no products in this economy is made to last. It's meant to be short-lived. And again, we can see how the consumption per person have been going up and up and up, and I expect it to increase further. What we see in local future, what we often met with is that a blaming on the individuals for the overconsumption, and also blaming human nature. I often hear this is part of the problem, if not the most important problem, because we are greedy as human beings. We're born greedy. Now, we don't agree with that. We think this is cultivated through marketing. And that means that the environmental impacts that we're seeing, for example, from clothing, which is very much part of that, and we are blamed for too, and where we are all the time pointing to responsible consumerism, which of course is part of it, but by no means the ultimate solution. And for example, I was reading here that the textiles account for 10% of global greenhouse emissions, which is in the tip of the iceberg, as the emission from, for example, global shipping isn't taken into account anywhere, whether it's textiles or food or any of the produce. The whole global shipping industry is not included in the carbon budgeting. It's invisible. And that's one of the reasons why we haven't been looking sufficiently at the need to shift from global to local, because we have not been accounting for the emissions and use of energy in the global trading. So, whoops. Going back to what I was saying before about the pointing the finger at the individual. Well, we are from the very start of our life groomed to consume. The average person today in the modern world, so-called modern world, is exposed to around 5,000 ads a day. And we are having specific targeting small children, teenage consumers that are very easy to influence and are said also to be very loyal consumers, and they influence their peer group. So 80% of all global brands, oh, sorry, there's a mistake here, are targeting teenagers specifically. And as you can see, a study in the US was showing that youngsters, teens between 12 and 17 years old, have about 145 brand conversations per week. So it definitely pays off to target young consumers. And what's at stake here is the identity for sale. You know, the marketing is very much geared at deconstructing our identity and replacing that by a corporate product. So deconstruction cultural diversity and pushing a corporate monoculture. And the global advertising expenses is huge. Last time I looked at it, which was a couple of years ago, it was 500 billion. And today I looked it up again, and we are now up to $755 billion that is spent on advertising, that is spent on creating the consumer. And what could we use this money on? Well, we could use it to transform our societies. We could eradicate extreme poverty worldwide. We could implement adaptation to climate change. We could pay for an ecological transition. And with all the consumption that we are seeing, have we become happier? Because of course, that's one of the things that they try to sell us. We will be happier if we consume more. Well, so far, this is not the case. Every evidence shows that happiness peaked, for example, in the industrialized countries in the US and the UK around the 1950s. And what we've seen today is quite the opposite. We've seen an epidemic of depression and anxiety amongst the young, and also widespread loneliness, particularly in industrial societies. So what we are advocating for at Local Futures and have been doing for many years is a shift in direction, practically and economically, shifting power away from global businesses to nation states, to democratically elected governments, and building up regional and local economies. We see it as a solution multiplier, such a shift that can help to reduce poverty, improve livelihoods, provide dignified jobs, revive rural areas, rebuild community, and bring democracy, direct democracy, closer to home, while it be an essential step to healing the planet. We need to change that policies that shape the economy, regulations, subsidies, taxes, in support of place-based businesses operating within ecological limits. And we need new trade treaties for the common good. This is very important, it's key for any change. And some of the policy changes that we need to consider, I mention it here because it doesn't matter which sector we are working in, be it food, be it textiles or something else, we need to look at policy shifts. We need to, for example, reject GDP as a measure of progress, and we need to adopt holistic indicators of well-being. We need to eliminate the unfair, destructive subsidies that are corporate welfare packages that are essentially marginalizing local producers and small producers. We also need to consider something like carbon trading and offset, which basically just is another excuse of continuing business as usual. We need to regulate trade. We need to think about monetary reform and fair taxing. And I was hearing also about debt relief, which is, of course, is central as well. We also need to think about tiered regulation. We can't have the same regulations for a global corporation and a small business with 10 employees. It's not the same regulation that we need, because then we will only favor the big and marginalize the small. We also need to think about shifting the money we have, the taxpayers' money, like the public procurement, in favor of sustainable, responsible businesses. And we need to redesign around the principle of localization towards stronger regional and local economies operating within ecological limits. So some of the things, like, there are lots of alternatives out there. The Preston model in the UK, which is was inspired by the evergreen cooperatives in Ohio, is a interesting and inspiring way to strengthen local economies, where anchor institutions that are often public institutions like universities, hospitals, and so forth, commit to buying locally produced goods and services, often from workers' cooperatives. That's a very important and quick way that we can help and strengthen local economies, local businesses, and fair and responsible businesses. Local food, the local food movement, has been on the forefront of what we call the localization movement, with community-supported agriculture, with new local shops, with local produce, with local markets, with diverse human-scale production. It's an inspiration, the local food movement, for other sectors, I think. We've also had a lot of local business, not a lot, but we've had some local businesses alliances that I think is an inspiration to all, where businesses, local independent businesses, band together in an alliance often to educate local government on the importance of local businesses. They are the ones that stay put, they're the ones that pay taxes, and they often have better working conditions for people. And this is also something that we need to do more of and look towards. Stronger local economies come when we shop, for example, in independent local shops. Studies have shown that when we spend $1 in an independent shop compared to, say, a chain store or a big supermarket, that money stays within the local economy 3.5 times longer. The local farmers markets, they might stay where you buy directly from producers. It will stay within the local economy 10 times longer. Sorry. In terms of one of, I think, the very inspiring existing textiles economies is the one in Prato that have been basically recycling, as far as I understand, old garments and making them into what they call regenerated wool, all the way dating back from the 1850s. And there are about 7,000 small specialized textile businesses in Prato that work together. They do different things. And together they have a textile system that is recycling 50% of the global recycled textiles. So an inspiration and a model that could and should be replicated other places. I'd also want to highlight the importance of, for the global to local shift, the local finance and investment. A lot of this has to do with food, which is what I normally work with, but I think could equally be applied, like the ethical banks and credit unions, to investing in local textile industry, in sustainable clothing, rather than planned obsolescence, producing clothing that lasts, that build up production on a local and regional level, so we don't all need to be dependent on textiles from far away, where we'd have no clue how they've been produced. The further away we get, the further away the distance between the producer and consumer, the more middlemen, the more likely things are to go wrong, and the more likely we are to be unaware of a whole lot of problems in between. You know, the arm becomes too long to see what the hand is doing. So equity trusts and local finance groups may be some of the ways that we can build up local, regional, and national textile systems. Local energy is obviously also very important. That is part of we are not only talking about shifting to renewable energy, but we also need to think about having decentralized, community-owned energy, so that we don't end up being dependent on very large corporations that will be controlling our energy as well as we have at present. Creative spaces like repair cafes is also the way we need to go. So less consumption and more creation. There are a number of initiatives that I find very inspirational. For example, the All Together Now in Pennsylvania, which is a coalition of people that are trying to build a stronger regional economy, linking together the urban and the rural communities, which they think both are needed together. And one of the things they have or are trying to build up is a clothing and textile coalition to create circular textile systems using the available materials, and also creating a dirt to shirt supply chain on a regional level. They're doing a lot of education towards consumers, so they also start to recognize the need to shop locally for local produce, and educating about the need for slow fashion rather than fast fashion. Their aim is to become self-reliant in clothing and textile. Probably will take some time, but the intention is there. They also have a hemp local supply chain coalition, where they're working with farmers and entrepreneurs and researchers. The idea is to rebuild hemp production and manufacturing in Pennsylvania as they had before hemp production was prohibited in the 1950s. And not only for clothing, but also for building, for insulation and so forth, fibers. And that is not only a good thing, of course, for Pennsylvania, but the idea of shifting away from the kind of monocultural cotton production that we are seeing that have taken over, and the polyester, and trying to build, regrow hemp and flax and other fibers is really, really necessary. Like I was saying, we used to grow hemp in Denmark, and it uses hardly any agrochemicals. It's more productive than cotton and much more durable. And it's not genetically modified. It doesn't use 25% of all the agrochemicals on a global scale. No? So there are a lot of positives of diversifying our textile industry and localizing. I wanted to mention a few a few initiatives that I'm aware of. We work in LADAKH, as Rebecca was saying. She was referring to Helena Norberg Hodge's Ancient Futures. So they have also been subjected to the global forces and have had their otherwise intact regional economy debilitated, and have also had need of rebuilding new or creating new initiatives to strengthen their economies. And one of these initiatives here is the LADAKH nomadic wool mills, where a young man, a social entrepreneur, Nawang Pumsok, had started a few years ago a local manufacturing with the pashmina wool that had otherwise been sold to intermediate at a very low price. So what he's created is a kind of a closed loop and a link between the local nomads, which play a hugely important role in Ladakh, that have the goats. They play also a role and in the ecosystem on an ecological level, setting up a mill and training local weavers, and they have their own shop. So it's a way of, they are selling to a lot of the people that buy are from tourists that come to Ladakh and other people, but they have basically closed the loop and are they are in charge of the, well, they keep the money within the local economy, and the profit goes to local people that are producing the wool and that are manufacturing the clothes. Also, the looms of Ladakh, it's a cooperative of women. They both knit and weave. The cooperative, some of the money, like the 37.5%, goes to the woman that made the item. They have like a little barcode to define who it was made by. The rest, 41%, goes to the cooperative to buy raw materials for the next season. A lot of that raw material is bought from the women themselves that have goats, and others go to administration, promotion, and training. But there's no money going to some distant shareholder here. Another inspiring initiative from India is the Desi Trust, which was started back in the 70s. They set up a shop to sell ecological products made by the Charaka Women's Society in Bangalore. They've increased to 15 outlets. And the idea is that they both promote sustainable agriculture and village industries, with the idea of strengthening local economies, reducing migration, and conserving their natural resources. So
hi, Anna.
They
Gavin.
say,
I'm so sorry, it's Gavin, the producer. Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to let you know you have about 2 minutes left, so sorry to rush you. I see you have a few slides left. I just wanted to let you know we've got.
Yeah, so
thank
you. So I just want to say the local textile in Germany is a very inspiring initiative, a network of people that are trying to push and promote and link up people working in the textiles, from designer to manufacturer, and also to educate about the need of and the importance of local textile systems. They're also trying to rescue existing textile manufacturers like this historic rug and carpet manufacturer, and helping them to survive. There are a lot of traditional people with machinery and a lifetime of skills that are about to be lost. So if any one of you know of anyone that wants to take over here in Germany, let us know. So we need to connect to change the I to a we, to resist, renew, and educate. We need to resist corporate globalization and join hands cross-sector and collaborate, not just work in our own silos. And we need to watch out for the propaganda that, for example, calls for more robotication, which is just another way of pushing jobless growth and corporate rule. And we need to educate each others and others to build a movement that is powerful enough to turn the tide. And that means from a big picture perspective, so we rethink basic assumptions and puncture the economic growth myth and show that another way is possible. I invite you to look at our website, Local Futures, and maybe explore our localization action guide, and also keep your eyes out for next World Localization Day. We hope a lot of you will join so we can do some more cross-sector collaboration.
Anja, thank you so much. That was incredible. And I very much appreciate your highlighting of the communities that have been holding our textile traditions and those who are trying to retain them. Our affiliate community who's present today, I think would really resonate with each of their community efforts to build up their bioregionally specific fibers and dyes. So I think this is a very resonating conversation. And I just want to hit on one thing that you said about we are over-regulating the small businesses and putting so much pressure on the individual, and we have deregulated the spaces for trade and for conglomerates that hold so much wealth and power, that the space that they operate in is often less regulated than what we see small businesses subject to. And I think in our community, we often see this kind of divide whereby, you know, there can be an anti-government sentiment or an anti-organizing sentiment because there's this fear of government or this fear that, and I understand, like, definitely autocrats and dictators have had their way in the world in the 20th century. We understand political history enough to know that. But do you have any words for, you know, just as we leave for break, you know, what it means for you as to see people like, have you seen organizing that has really excited you, where people have been able to come together to change policy, even those who are like a little hesitant to get involved politically? Like, what are some of those, any examples or parting words on organizing together, so that we're not all, suffering alone?
Well, I think it's absolutely fundamental, because if we're not working together and we end up feeling very disempowered, it's very easy to get discouraged by the crisis that are going on. I think, there's so many different examples, but I think one time I was involved in a citizens' assembly. I was invited to be part of a citizen assembly. And the interesting part of that was we were brought together from across the political spectrum to discuss a very sticky issue about taxation, on whether or not one should have a taxation on meat, a carbon taxation on meat. And there were people there that, you know, ate meat every day. There were vegans and there were old people, no young people. Now, after being together for a day and analyzing together, we came out with a very progressive policy recommendation across the political spectrum, from the left to the right. Now, I don't think under any other circumstances would we have been able to agree and actually come out with very specific recommendations for policy. So I feel that the citizen assembly model is really, really good for getting very different people to consider and make recommendations for policies.
Thank you so much. So at the community level, coming up with solutions to answers can, across political lines, creates effective, nuanced, and very kind of surgically thoughtful ways of engaging with complexity. I like it. Thank you. Well,
Thank you, Rebecca.
I appreciate this so much. It's a delight to have you here.